The crack of the leather belt against her skin echoed through the dimly lit farmhouse as Violet Dawson backed away from her father's imposing figure, tears streaming down her face. The year was 1875, and in the small town of Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, a woman's fate was decided by the men who claimed to protect her. "You ungrateful child," Herbert Dawson roared, his weathered face contorted with rage. "Judge Patterson's son is offering you security, respectability. What more could a worthless girl like you ask for?" Violet clutched her reddened arm where the belt had struck, her honey-brown hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. At 20 years old, she had endured her father's temper since her mother's death 10 years prior, but today was different. Today, she had finally found the courage to say no. "I won't marry Theodore Patterson, father," she declared, her voice quivering but resolute. "He's cruel and 30 years my senior. I've seen how he treats the saloon girls, how the belt whistled through the air again, catching her across the shoulder." Violet cried out, stumbling back against the kitchen table. "You'll marry who I tell you to marry." Herbert advanced on her, spittle flying from his lips. "The betrothal papers are signed. Judge Patterson has paid your bride price. You think I care what you want? You're nothing but a burden I've carried for too long." Outside the farmhouse window, Xavier Cross reined his dappled gray stallion to a halt. At 26, the cowboy had spent the last 8 years working cattle drives and breaking horses throughout the Arizona Territory. He'd come to Cottonwood Springs following rumors of ranch work, only to find himself witness to a scene that made his blood boil. Xavier had been acquainted with Herbert Dawson briefly at the town saloon enough to recognize him as a man prone to gambling and drink. He'd come to deliver a message from the station master, but what he heard through the open window stopped him cold. "The wedding is tomorrow at noon," Herbert growled, grabbing Violet by her upper arms. "And if you embarrass me in front of the whole town, I swear I'll lock you in the root cellar until you learn your place." "Please, father," Violet sobbed, her face stricken with fear. "I'll work harder. I'll take in washing from town. Anything, just don't make me marry him." The sound of another slap propelled Xavier from his saddle. His spurs jangled as his boots hit the dusty ground. Without hesitation, he strode to the farmhouse door and pounded his fist against the weathered wood. "Dawson, open up," he called, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the revolver at his hip. The commotion inside went silent. A moment later, Herbert Dawson yanked the door open, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "What in tarnation do you want, Cross? I'm in the middle of a family matter." Xavier's steely gray eyes took in the scene behind Herbert. Violet cowering near the table, her face tear-streaked, an angry welt forming on her cheek. Her simple blue dress was torn at the shoulder, and the fear in her wide amber eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Got a telegram for you from the station master," Xavier said evenly, never taking his eyes off Herbert as he handed over a folded piece of paper. "Seems mighty important." As Herbert fumbled with the telegram, Xavier caught Violet's gaze. A silent understanding passed between them, a promise of help, a plea for rescue. With the slightest tilt of his head toward the door, he communicated his intent. Herbert scanned the telegram, momentarily distracted. "What nonsense is this?" "I'm not expecting any." It was all the opening Xavier needed. In 2 swift strides, he was past Herbert and at Violet's side. He grabbed her hand. "Run," he whispered urgently. Violet didn't hesitate. Something in the stranger's eyes, compassion, determination, strength, gave her the courage she desperately needed. Together they bolted for the door, pushing past a stunned Herbert. "What the devil, come back here," Herbert bellowed, lunging for his daughter. Xavier shoved the older man aside, sending him crashing into a chair. Violet ran toward the gray stallion, heart pounding in her chest. Behind them, Herbert was scrambling to his feet, reaching for the shotgun leaning against the wall. "Get on," Xavier ordered, boosting Violet onto his horse before swinging up behind her in one fluid motion. The stallion danced nervously beneath their combined weight as Xavier gathered the reins. "You can't take my property." Herbert staggered onto the porch, raising the shotgun. Xavier spurred his horse just as the shotgun blast tore through the air. The shot went wide, scattering dirt near the horse's hooves. The stallion bolted, powerful muscles bunching as he carried them away from the farmhouse, Violet clinging to the saddle horn while Xavier's strong arm steadied her around the waist. The thunder of hooves matched Violet's racing heartbeat as they galloped down the dusty road, putting distance between themselves and her father's rage. Wind whipped her hair around her face as tears streamed from her eyes, tears of fear, relief, and utter disbelief at her own daring. Only when they crested a hill overlooking the sprawling wilderness did Xavier slow the horse to a canter, then a walk. Violet's entire body trembled, the reality of what she'd done beginning to sink in. "You're free," Xavier said simply, his voice low and reassuring near her ear. "He can't hurt you anymore." Violet turned slightly in the saddle, looking into the face of the man who had just upended her entire existence. His features were sun-browned and weathered, but his eyes held a kindness she hadn't seen in years. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier's expression hardened as he looked back toward the direction of the farmhouse, now just a distant speck on the landscape. "No man has the right to treat a woman that way, and no father should sell his daughter like cattle." "You don't understand," Violet said, panic rising in her chest. "Judge Patterson is the most powerful man in the county. My father owes him money. They'll come looking for me." "Let them come," Xavier replied with quiet confidence. "We've got a head start, and I know this country better than most. I can get you somewhere safe." "Where?" Violet asked, suddenly realizing she had nowhere to go, no possessions save for the clothes on her back and not a penny to her name. "My sister runs a boarding house in Silverton, about 3 days' ride from here," Xavier explained. "She helps women in difficult situations. You'll be safe there until we figure something more permanent." As the adrenaline began to ebb, exhaustion and pain flooded through Violet's body. The reality of her bruises, both fresh and faded, made themselves known. She swayed slightly in the saddle. "I don't even know your name," she murmured. "Xavier Cross," he replied, steadying her with his arm. "Most folks just call me Xav." "Violet Dawson," she responded automatically, then hesitated. "Though I suppose I shouldn't use that name anymore." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Might be wise to leave it behind, at least for now." He looked toward the setting sun. "We need to keep moving. There's a place I know about an hour's ride from here where we can make camp for the night." As they rode across the rugged landscape, Violet was struck by the vastness of the territory spreading before them. All her life had been confined to her father's farm and the small town nearby. Now, for better or worse, she was truly in the Wild West, her future as uncertain as the distant horizon. The fading sunlight painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson as Xavier guided his horse along a barely visible trail. Violet's thoughts churned with fear, doubt, and beneath it all, a tentative hope. Her father's last attempt to control her destiny had instead thrust her into the unknown, into freedom. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in her memory, tomorrow would be her choice. Violet took a deep breath of the clear desert air, her tears drying in the gentle evening breeze as they rode toward an uncertain future. As darkness fell over the Arizona desert, Xavier guided his stallion through a narrow passage between towering rock formations. The temperature dropped rapidly without the sun's warmth, and Violet shivered in her thin dress. Without comment, Xavier removed his leather duster and wrapped it around her shoulders, the lingering warmth of his body and the faint scent of tobacco and pine enveloping her. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "Just ahead," he said, pointing to a small hollow nestled among the rocks. The campsite was sheltered from the wind and hidden from the trail, clearly a place Xavier had used before. A small stream trickled nearby, providing precious water in the arid landscape. With practiced efficiency, Xavier dismounted and helped Violet down from the saddle, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle after the long ride. "First time on horseback?" he asked, a hint of amusement softening his weathered features. "Not exactly," Violet replied, rubbing her sore legs, "but it's been years. My father sold our horses when I was 15, said they were too expensive to keep." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable as he began unloading supplies from his saddlebags. "Rest a bit. I'll get a fire going." Violet sank onto a flat rock, watching as Xavier efficiently gathered dry brush and kindling. His movements were sure and economical, reflecting years of self-reliance in the wilderness. Within minutes, a small fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows against the rock walls surrounding them. "Are you hungry?" he asked, pulling a small bundle from his saddlebags. Violet realized she hadn't eaten since morning. "Yes, thank you." Xavier unwrapped some jerky and hardtack, along with a small tin of preserved peaches, a luxury in these parts. He offered her the best portions, which she accepted gratefully. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft nickering of Xavier's horse as it grazed on sparse desert grass. "Your father," Xavier finally said, breaking the silence. "He's been that way a long time." Violet stared into the flames, memories flickering through her mind. "Not always. When my mother was alive, he was different, stern but fair. After she died of fever, something broke in him. He turned to drink, then gambling. Each year he grew more bitter, more angry." She touched her cheek where a bruise was forming. "This past year has been the worst. The farm is failing. He owes money to half the county, Judge Patterson most of all. And Patterson's son wanted to marry you," Xavier concluded, his jaw tightening. "Theodore Patterson is 48 years old and has buried 2 wives already," Violet said quietly. "People in town whisper that he worked them to death. He saw me at church last month and told my father he wanted me. Next thing I knew, father was telling me I was betrothed." Xavier prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "You were brave to refuse." Violet gave a hollow laugh. "Not brave, desperate. I'd rather die than be that man's wife." "Well, you won't have to be either," Xavier said firmly. "Once we reach Silverton, my sister Eliza will help you start fresh. She's helped other women before." Violet studied him curiously. "Why does your sister help women in trouble?" A shadow passed over Xavier's face. "Our mother was trapped in a marriage much like the one you were facing. Our father was a cruel man who treated her like property. She died when I was 14, Eliza 16. We always wondered if things might have been different if she'd had somewhere to run to." Understanding dawned in Violet's eyes. "That's why you stopped today. Why you helped me." Xavier met her gaze across the fire. "I stop whenever I see someone being mistreated. But yes, perhaps it hit closer to home." As the night deepened around them, Violet felt a strange sense of security despite the uncertainty of her situation. Xavier arranged his bedroll for her near the fire, insisting she take it while he kept watch. "What about you?" she asked, hesitating before the bedroll. "I'll sleep light," he assured her. Used to keeping one eye open on the trail, despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Violet. Her mind raced with images of her father's rage, the thundering of hooves as they escaped, and the enormity of her decision to flee. What would become of her now? She had no skills beyond cooking, cleaning, and basic farming, the life of a frontier daughter. She had no money, no possessions. Xavier. She whispered into the darkness. His voice came from where he sat propped against a boulder, his rifle across his knees. What if they find us before we reach Silverton? In the dying firelight, she saw him check his revolver, the metal gleaming dully. They won't, he said with quiet confidence. But if they do, I'll handle it. Get some rest, Violet. Tomorrow will be a long day. Eventually, lulled by the crackling fire and Xavier's reassuring presence, Violet drifted into an exhausted sleep. Her dreams were troubled flashes of her father's face contorted with rage, Theodore Patterson's cold eyes appraising her like livestock, and throughout it all, the sensation of running, always running. She awoke with a start just before dawn, disoriented until the events of the previous day came rushing back. Xavier was already awake, brewing coffee in a small tin pot over the rekindled fire. "Morning," he said, handing her a tin cup of the strong, bitter liquid. "Thought you might need this. We should get moving soon." Violet accepted the coffee gratefully, wincing as her body protested. Every muscle ached from the unaccustomed horseback riding, and the bruises from her father's belt throbbed painfully. Xavier noticed her discomfort. "There's a stream just behind those rocks if you want to freshen up. I'll keep watch from here." Grateful for the chance to wash, Violet made her way to the small stream. The water was cold but refreshing as she gently cleaned her face and arms, wincing at the sight of the purple bruises marking her skin. She smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could, and attempted to tame her tangled hair with her fingers. When she returned to camp, Xavier had packed up their meager supplies and saddled his horse. He paused in his work, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "What is it?" she asked self-consciously. "Nothing," he said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. "It's just even with everything you've been through, there's something about you that reminds me of a wildflower that refuses to be trampled." The unexpected compliment brought warmth to Violet's cheeks. Before she could respond, Xavier was all business again, helping her onto the horse before mounting behind her. "We'll ride hard today," he explained as they set out. "The first 24 hours are the most dangerous. By tomorrow, we should be far enough away that they'll have a harder time tracking us." As they rode out of the sheltered hollow into the rosy light of dawn, Violet felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. Behind her lay everything she had ever known, a life of servitude and fear. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty, yet it was an uncertainty of her own choosing. Xavier guided his horse skillfully across the rugged terrain, sometimes following barely visible trails, other times cutting across open country. He was quiet for long stretches, alert to their surroundings, but occasionally he would point out landmarks or share stories of his travels through the territory. "See that butte over there," he said, indicating a distinctive flat-topped mountain in the distance. "Apache legend says it's the resting place of their ancient spirits. I once spent 3 days sheltering in a cave at its base during a thunderstorm." Violet found herself fascinated by these glimpses into Xavier's nomadic life. So different from her own restricted existence, his stories painted pictures of freedom and adventure across the vast western landscape. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. They stopped briefly in the shade of a solitary cottonwood to rest the horse and share a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack. Xavier seemed increasingly vigilant, frequently scanning the horizon behind them. You think they're following us?" Violet asked, voicing the fear that had been growing throughout the morning. Xavier took a long drink from his canteen before answering. "Your father, probably not. He's likely nursing a hangover and his wounded pride. But Judge Patterson has resources and connections, if your father went to him." He didn't need to finish the thought. Violet knew the judge's influence extended throughout the territory. If he wanted to find her to protect his investment in a bride for his son, he had the means to do so. "We should keep moving," Xavier said, helping her back onto the horse. "There's a small trading post about 4 hours' ride from here. The man who runs it, Joe Blackstone, is a friend. He might have news of any search parties and we can get supplies." As they continued their journey, the landscape gradually changed from desert scrub to more varied terrain with scattered pines and junipers. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, offering some relief from the relentless sun. Violet found herself growing more comfortable with Xavier's proximity, the initial awkwardness of sharing a saddle fading as the hours passed. There was something reassuring about the solid strength of his chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "How did you become a cowboy?" she asked during a quiet stretch of trail, curious about the man who had so drastically altered her fate. Xavier chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. "Wasn't much choice for a 14-year-old orphan boy with a sister to look after. Started as a stable hand, learned to break horses, worked my way up to cattle drives. Been drifting ever since, taking work where I can find it." "And your sister? How did she end up in Silverton?" "Eliza married a silver miner when she was 18, Xavier explained. "Good man, treated her well. When he died in a mine collapse 5 years ago, she used the insurance money to buy the boarding house. She's made quite a success of it." "She sounds remarkable," Violet said, trying to imagine the kind of strength it would take to forge an independent life after such a loss. "She is," Xavier agreed, pride evident in his voice. "Toughest person I know. You'll like her." The sun was low in the sky when they crested a ridge, and Xavier pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley below. "Blackstone's trading post. We'll rest there tonight." The trading post consisted of a main building constructed of rough-hewn logs, a small stable, and several outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a few horses were hitched to the post out front. Xavier approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings before guiding his horse down the slope. "Stay close," he murmured as they drew nearer. "Let me do the talking." Violet nodded, suddenly nervous about interacting with strangers. Would someone recognize her? Would word have spread already about her flight? Xavier dismounted first, then helped Violet down. Her legs nearly buckled from the long hours in the saddle, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "You all right?" "I'll manage," she assured him, straightening her spine despite the pain. The door to the trading post swung open as they approached, revealing a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper beard. His weathered face broke into a grin at the sight of Xavier. "Well, I'll be damned. Xavier Cross, you old wolf. Haven't seen you since that cattle drive to Santa Fe last spring." "Joe," Xavier greeted him with a nod, clasping the man's offered hand. "Good to see you're still keeping this place standing." Joe Blackstone's shrewd eyes shifted to Violet, taking in her disheveled appearance and the fading bruise on her cheek. His expression remained neutral, but understanding seemed to pass between the two men. "This is Violet," Xavier said simply. "We're heading to Silverton. Thought we might rest here tonight if you've got space." "Always space for you, Xav," Joe replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "Martha just put supper on. You're welcome to join us." The interior of the trading post was divided between a store area filled with goods, everything from tools and ammunition to fabric and canned goods, and a living area with a large hearth. A plump woman with kind eyes was setting plates on a worn wooden table. She looked up as they entered, her gaze lingering on Violet with motherly concern. "Martha, these folks will be joining us for supper," Joe announced. "Xavier Cross, you remember him, and Miss Violet." "Of course I remember," Martha said warmly. "Any friend of Xavier's is welcome at our table. You poor dear," she added to Violet. "You look exhausted. Come sit by the fire while I fetch you some tea." Grateful for the woman's kindness, Violet sank into a chair near the hearth while Xavier and Joe stepped to a corner of the room, speaking in low voices. From fragments of their conversation, she gathered Xavier was inquiring about news from Cottonwood Springs and whether any riders had passed through looking for them. Martha returned with a steaming cup of tea and a sympathetic smile. "Drink this, honey. It'll help with the aches. I can see you've had a hard journey." "Thank you," Violet murmured, accepting the tea gratefully. "You're very kind." "Nonsense," Martha dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Just doing what any decent person would do." She lowered her voice. "Joe and Xavier go back years. If you're with him, we know you're good people in need of help." Violet sipped the fragrant tea, feeling some of the tension ease from her body. The simple kindness of strangers was something she'd rarely experienced under her father's watchful eye. Supper was a hearty stew with fresh baked bread, the most delicious meal Violet could remember having in years. Joe and Martha made no inquiries about her circumstances, instead filling the meal with tales of travelers who had passed through and news from various settlements across the territory. Only after the dishes were cleared did Joe turn to more serious matters. "3 riders came through yesterday," he told Xavier, "asking about a young woman with honey-brown hair traveling with a cowboy on a gray horse." Violet's heart sank, her momentary sense of safety evaporating. "Judge Patterson's men?" Xavier asked, his expression grim. Joe nodded. "Said they were looking for a man who'd kidnapped the judge's future daughter-in-law, offered a $100 reward for information." "That's a lie," Violet burst out, unable to contain herself. "I wasn't kidnapped. I was escaping a forced marriage to a cruel man twice my age. We figured as much," Martha said gently, patting Violet's hand. "Don't worry, dear. We sent those men on a wild goose chase toward Tucson." "They're a day ahead of us then," Xavier mused. "We'll need to be careful, maybe change our route." "I can help with that," Joe said. "There's an old mining trail through the high country. Adds a day to the journey but keeps you clear of the main roads where they'll be watching." After supper, while Xavier and Joe pored over a rough map, Martha took Violet to a small bedroom off the main house. "You can wash up proper here," she said, showing her a basin of warm water and a sliver of precious soap. "And I've got a spare dress that might fit you. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean." Tears sprang to Violet's eyes at the unexpected generosity. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," Martha replied firmly. "Joe and I know what it's like to start over with nothing. 20 years ago, we fled Tennessee with little more than the clothes on our backs after Joe killed a man who was beating his sister half to death. The law called it murder. We called it justice." Violet was stunned by this revelation. "You've been running all this time," Martha smiled sadly. "Not running, dear. Living, making a life on our own terms. That's what you're doing now, choosing your own path." She patted Violet's shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." Left alone, Violet sank gratefully into the simple washing ritual, scrubbing away days of dust and fear from her skin. The dress Martha had provided was a practical brown calico, slightly loose but far sturdier than her torn blue dress. After changing, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, overwhelmed by the events that had brought her here. 2 days ago, she had awakened in her father's house, resigned to a life without choices. Now she was a fugitive, fleeing across the territory with a man she barely knew, depending on the kindness of strangers. The freedom she had longed for was terrifying in its vastness. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Xavier stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it. "Joe's given us supplies for the journey," he said. "We'll leave at first light, take the mountain trail." Violet nodded, suddenly uncertain in his presence. The question that had been building all day finally spilled out. "Why are you risking so much for me? You could be arrested or worse." Xavier leaned against the doorframe, considering her question. "When I was a boy, my father beat my mother for speaking to another man after church. I was too small, too weak to stop him. I swore then that I'd never stand by and watch someone suffer if I could help." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Everyone deserves the right to choose their own fate, Violet." In the soft lamplight, his features seemed less weathered, revealing a younger man than she'd initially thought. For the first time, Violet noticed the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly when he spoke. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Xavier nodded, his expression softening. "Get some sleep. We've got a hard ride ahead." As he turned to leave, Violet called after him. "Xavier," he paused, looking back. "I don't regret it coming with you, whatever happens." A small smile touched his lips. "Neither do I." Long after he'd gone, Violet lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of the trading post. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps there could be more to life than survival, that somewhere ahead lay not just freedom from fear, but the possibility of joy. Dawn brought a sky streaked with crimson and gold as violet, and Xavier prepared to depart from Blackstone's trading post. Joe had provided them with additional supplies, preserved food, a canteen, a small knife for Violet, and most precious of all, a hand-drawn map of the mountain trail that would hopefully keep them clear of Patterson's men. "The trail's rough in places," Joe warned as Xavier secured the supplies to his saddle, "but it'll bring you to the east side of Silverton, away from the main roads." Martha pressed a small bundle into Violet's hands. "Some herbs for tea and a bit of salve for those bruises," she explained quietly. "And this," she slipped a small leather pouch into Violet's pocket, "is just a little something to help you start fresh." When Violet began to protest, Martha shook her head firmly. "Everyone needs a helping hand sometimes. You can pay it forward to someone else one day." Tears stung Violet's eyes as she embraced the older woman. "I'll never forget your kindness." "Be safe," Martha whispered, "and be happy." As Xavier helped Violet mount the gray stallion, Joe pulled him aside for a final word. "3 more riders came through late last night asking the same questions. Didn't like it when I played dumb. They're getting desperate and dangerous." Xavier's expression hardened. "We'll be careful." "One more thing," Joe added, handing Xavier a second revolver, "just in case." With final farewells, they set off just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. The mountain trail began as little more than a deer path winding through increasingly dense pine forest. Xavier led the horse on foot for the steepest sections, the terrain too treacherous for riding double. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley they'd left behind. The trading post was just a speck in the distance, and beyond it, the vast expanse of territory they'd crossed since leaving Cottonwood Springs. "It's beautiful," Violet murmured, taking in the panoramic view of mesas, canyons, and distant mountains shimmering in the heat. "One of the reasons I never settled in one place," Xavier admitted, pausing beside her. "Too much world to see." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the trail growing more challenging as it wound through rocky passes and along narrow ridges. Xavier remained vigilant, frequently scanning both the path ahead and their back trail for signs of pursuit. "Will we make Silverton by tomorrow?" Violet asked as they stopped to rest the horse near a small spring. Xavier shook his head. "Day after, if we're lucky. This trail adds distance, but it's safer than the main roads." As the sun began its descent, Xavier led them to a small plateau sheltered by a rock overhanging a natural campsite with good visibility of the surrounding area. "We'll stop here for the night," he decided, helping Violet dismount. Her muscles protested after another full day in the saddle, but she was growing accustomed to the discomfort. They worked together setting up camp, falling into an easy rhythm that belied their short acquaintance. Xavier gathered firewood while Violet arranged their bedroll and supplies. The simple domesticity of the tasks provided a strange comfort after the tension of their flight. As darkness fell, they sat beside the small fire, sharing a meal of beans and salt pork from their supplies. The mountain air grew chilly, and Violet wrapped Xavier's duster tighter around her shoulders. "May I ask you something?" she ventured after they had eaten in companionable silence. "Of course," Xavier replied, sipping coffee from his tin cup. "What will you do after we reach Silverton?" "After you've delivered me safely to your sister," the question seemed to surprise him. "Haven't thought that far ahead, truth be told. There's usually ranch work to be found. Might head up to Colorado for the summer roundup." "Always moving," Violet observed. "Don't you ever want to stay in one place?" Xavier poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. "Used to dream of having my own spread someday. A small ranch, nothing fancy, just a place that's mine." He shrugged as if dismissing the notion. "Cowboys' wages don't go far toward land. It's a good dream," Violet said softly. "A place of your own." "What about you?" Xavier asked, turning the question back to her. "What will you do with your freedom?" Violet stared into the flames, considering. Her entire life had been dictated by her father's demands. The concept of choosing her own future was still foreign. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can cook and keep house. Perhaps I could find work as a housekeeper or cook somewhere, or maybe in a shop." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how limited her options were. "You could teach," Xavier suggested. "You read and write well. I saw you looking at Joe's books." Violet smiled, surprised he had noticed. "I've always loved reading. My mother taught me before she died, and I practiced whenever I could find books." Her smile faded. "But who would hire a woman with no credentials, no references?" "Silverton's growing fast," Xavier said. "New families arriving all the time. They'll need someone to teach their children." He gestured toward the star-filled sky. "Out here, people care more about what you can do than where you came from." His confidence warmed something inside her. For the first time, Violet allowed herself to imagine a future built on possibilities rather than restrictions, a life where she might contribute something meaningful, where she might find not just safety but fulfillment. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze across the fire, "for believing I could be more than what my father said I was." Xavier's expression softened in the firelight. "Your father was wrong about a lot of things, Violet. Most of all, he was wrong about you." The quiet certainty in his voice touched something deep within her. In that moment, with the vast wilderness spread around them and the infinite sky above, Violet felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. As the night deepened, Xavier insisted she take the bedroll while he kept watch. Violet protested that he needed rest too, but he was adamant. "I'll wake you for second watch," he promised, though they both knew he wouldn't. Despite her exhaustion, Violet found sleep elusive. Her mind kept returning to their conversation, to the unexpected connection forming between them. Xavier Cross was unlike any man she'd known, strong without cruelty, confident without arrogance. He'd risked everything to help a stranger, expecting nothing in return. From where she lay, Violet could see his silhouette against the starry sky as he sat vigilant at the edge of their camp. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since her mother died. It was dangerous, she knew, this growing fondness for a man whose life was spent wandering from place to place. Once they reached Silverton, he would likely move on, continuing his nomadic existence while she built a new life in one place. Their paths had crossed by chance, through violence and escape. It was foolish to imagine they might converge beyond this journey. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, Violet's last conscious thought was a wish that their trails might continue together, at least for a little while longer. The sound of a twig snapping jolted Violet awake. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, casting the campsite in pale gray shadows. Xavier was instantly alert, his revolver drawn as he moved silently to her side. "Someone's coming," he whispered, helping her to her feet. "Get behind those rocks. Now." Heart pounding, Violet crouched behind a large boulder as Xavier quickly scattered dirt over their fire and gathered their most essential supplies. His gray stallion, tethered nearby, sensed the tension and shifted nervously. From her hiding place, Violet could see the trail they had followed the previous day. 3 riders appeared on the ridge below their campsite, moving slowly as they examined the ground for tracks. Even in the dim light, she could make out the glint of rifles across their saddles. "Patterson's men," Xavier breathed, dropping to a crouch beside her. "They're following our trail." "How?" Violet whispered, fear closing her throat. "We were so careful." "Good tracker," Xavier muttered grimly. "See the one in front, that's Lucas Reed. Used to hunt Apache for the army. He can follow tracks most men would miss." The riders were drawing closer, methodically working their way up the trail toward their plateau. There was nowhere to run, the only path forward continued up the mountain, and they'd be exposed the moment they tried to take it. "We have to split up," Xavier decided, his voice low and urgent. "I'll lead them away while you continue to Silverton." "No," Violet protested, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you." "They'll have to catch me first," Xavier replied with grim determination. He pressed Joe's map into her hands. "Follow this exactly. Stay on the high trail until you reach Devil's Pass, then follow the creek down to the East Road. Eliza's boarding house is on Cedar Street, yellow house with green shutters." "Xavier, please," Violet begged, tears filling her eyes. "Come with me." For a fleeting moment, his stoic expression softened. His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face with unexpected gentleness. "Find Eliza. Tell her Xav sent you. She'll keep you safe." He pressed something else into her palm, a small leather wallet. "There's enough money here to get you started. Don't argue," he added when she began to protest. The riders were less than 100 yards away now. Any moment they would spot the remains of the campfire or Xavier's horse. "You need to go," Xavier insisted, checking both revolvers. "I'll create a diversion, draw them west away from the Silverton Trail." "How will I find you again?" Violet asked, hating how her voice broke on the question. Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wouldn't name. "I'll find you in Silverton when it's safe," he promised. "Now go. Stay low and don't look back." Before she could protest further, Xavier was gone, moving swiftly toward his horse. Violet remained frozen behind the boulder, watching as he mounted and deliberately rode into view of the approaching men. "Looking for someone," Xavier called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The three riders reined in sharply, rifles coming up. "That's him." One of them shouted. "Where's the girl, Cross?" "Long gone," Xavier replied calmly. "You boys are wasting your time." "Judge Patterson wants his property back," the lead rider Reed growled, "and your head on a pike for interfering." "He'll be disappointed on both counts," Xavier said, then abruptly wheeled his horse and galloped west along the ridge. The riders immediately gave chase, spurring their mounts after him. Gunshots echoed across the mountainside, but Xavier was already disappearing around a bend in the trail, drawing them away from where Violet hid. Only when the sounds of pursuit had faded did Violet dare to move. Every instinct screamed at her to follow Xavier, to somehow help him against those three armed men. But she knew that would only endanger them. Both the best thing she could do was reach Silverton as he'd instructed. With shaking hands, she gathered what supplies she could carry and consulted the map. The trail continued northeast, eventually joining a creek that would lead her down to more traveled roads. According to Xavier's estimate, she was still at least a day and a half from Silverton on foot. Slinging a canteen over her shoulder and tucking the small knife Martha had given her into her boot, Violet took one last look in the direction Xavier had disappeared. The distant crack of another gunshot made her flinch. "Be safe," she whispered into the morning air. Then, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, Violet turned and began making her way up the mountain trail alone. The path grew steeper and more treacherous as it climbed through dense pine forest. Violet moved as quickly as she dared, constantly glancing over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The morning sun climbed higher, its heat building despite the elevation. By midday, her dress was soaked with sweat, her throat parched despite careful rationing of water. She paused in the shade of a towering pine, consulting the map again. If she was reading it correctly, Devil's Pass should be just ahead, a narrow gap between two peaks that would mark the highest point of her journey before she began the descent toward Silverton. As Violet folded the map and prepared to continue, a movement in the forest below caught her eye. Her heart lurched as she spotted a lone rider working his way up the trail she had followed. The distance was too great to identify the person, but the deliberate way they studied the ground suggested they were tracking her. One of Patterson's men must have broken off from the main group, guessing that she and Xavier had split up. Fear gave her new energy as Violet abandoned the trail, scrambling directly upward through the underbrush toward Devil's Pass. The direct route was harder but would be more difficult to follow. By late afternoon, she reached the pass, a wind-scoured gap between granite peaks that offered a breathtaking view of the valley beyond. In the far distance, she could just make out what must be Silverton, a cluster of buildings nestled beside a river, so close, yet still so far. Exhausted, Violet sank onto a boulder, allowing herself a few precious sips of water. Her food was nearly gone, her feet blistered inside her worn shoes. But the sight of her destination renewed her determination. According to the map, she needed to follow a creek down from the pass to reach the east road. Violet spotted the waterway little more than a trickle this high up and began making her way toward it. The descent was treacherous, the ground loose and shifting beneath her feet. Several times she slipped, once sliding several yards down a scree slope before managing to catch herself. Her hands were scraped raw, her dress torn at the knees. As twilight approached, Violet reached a small clearing beside the now larger creek. Her body screamed for rest, but the knowledge that someone was following her drove her onward. She could follow the creek by moonlight if necessary. Reaching Silverton and Xavier's sister was all that mattered. The crack of a rifle shot froze her in her tracks. The bullet splintered bark from a tree just feet away. "That's far enough, Miss Dawson," called a voice from the trees behind her. "The next one won't miss." Slowly, Violet turned. A man emerged from the shadows, rifle trained on her. She recognized him as one of the three who had been pursuing them, a lean, hard-faced man with a week's growth of beard. "Judge Patterson wants his future daughter-in-law returned," the man said, approaching cautiously. "I'm to bring you back alive. Your cowboy friend, though." He shrugged. "Reed's probably finished him by now." Ice filled Violet's veins at his casual mention of Xavier. "I won't go back," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'd rather die here." The man laughed, an ugly sound. "Ain't up to you, girl. Judge is paying good money and his boy's still wanting a wife." He gestured with the rifle. "Now move. My horse is back up the trail." Violet's mind raced. The knife in her boot was useless against a rifle. She might try running, but he'd shoot her before she got 10 feet. Her only advantage was her knowledge of what lay ahead, the steep, treacherous descent she'd just navigated. "All right," she said, feigning defeat. "I'll come." She turned as if to walk back up the trail, then deliberately stumbled near the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped away sharply toward the creek below. "Please," she gasped, falling to her knees. "I'm exhausted. Can I have some water before we go?" The man approached warily, rifle still trained on her. "Make it quick." As he drew near, Violet gathered her courage. With a silent prayer, she lunged suddenly, not at her captor but away from him, throwing herself down the steep embankment toward the creek. "Damn it!" the man shouted, firing wildly as Violet tumbled down the slope. Pain exploded through her body as she rolled uncontrollably down the hillside, crashing through underbrush and bouncing off rocks. She was vaguely aware of the man scrambling after her, cursing as he lost his footing on the treacherous slope. Violet landed hard at the bottom, the breath knocked from her lungs. The creek gurgled just feet away. Through a haze of pain, she forced herself to move, crawling toward the water and the deeper shadows beyond. Behind her, she could hear her pursuer still struggling down the hillside, his curses growing more colorful with each slide and stumble. Using the last of her strength, Violet pulled herself into a dense thicket of brush alongside the creek, burrowing as deep as she could into the concealing vegetation. She lay absolutely still, barely daring to breathe as the man finally reached the bottom of the slope. In the gathering darkness, he cast about furiously, searching for any sign of her. "I know you're here somewhere," he shouted. "You're just making it worse for yourself." The light was fading rapidly now, the forest filling with shadows. The man lit a match, its feeble glow illuminating his frustrated features as he searched the creek bank. Eventually, he gave up, cursing viciously as he began climbing back up the slope. "I'll find you in the morning," he called into the darkness. "No way you're making it to Silverton in your condition." Only when his footsteps had faded completely did Violet dare to move. Pain lanced through her right ankle when she tried to stand, sprained or possibly broken. Her body was a catalog of injuries, cuts, bruises, possibly cracked ribs. But she was alive and still free. The creek was her lifeline now, her guide to salvation. Xavier had told her to follow it down to the East Road. From there, Silverton was just a few hours' journey. Using a branch as a makeshift crutch, Violet began limping alongside the creek. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, but progress was agonizingly slow. Each step sent fresh pain shooting through her injured ankle. Throughout the long night, Violet pushed onward, stopping only when exhaustion threatened to overcome her. During these brief rests, her thoughts invariably turned to Xavier. Was he alive? Had he somehow eluded the men chasing him? The bounty hunter's casual certainty that Xavier had been finished haunted her. Dawn found her still following the creek, now wider and more swiftly flowing as it descended toward the valley. The forest had thinned, giving way to scattered pines and open meadows. In the early morning light, Violet caught sight of something that made her heart leap. A dirt road cutting across the meadow ahead, exactly where the map had indicated the east road would be. Summoning her last reserves of strength, Violet limped toward the road. From here, Silverton was perhaps 5 miles away, an impossible distance in her condition, but she had to try. She had barely reached the road when the sound of an approaching wagon made her freeze. Instinctively, she shrank back toward the cover of the trees, uncertain whether to show herself or hide. After her encounter with the bounty hunter, she was wary of any stranger. The wagon appeared around a bend, a simple farm wagon drawn by 2 workhorses. An older couple sat on the bench seat, the woman holding a parasol against the morning sun. They looked harmless enough, but Violet remained hidden, watching. As the wagon drew nearer, the woman suddenly pointed. "Samuel, look there, by those trees." The man reined in the horses, peering in Violet's direction. "Hello," he called. "Someone there?" Violet hesitated, torn between caution and desperation. Her injuries and exhaustion would prevent her from reaching Silverton on her own, but could she trust these strangers? The woman's concerned voice decided her. "Are you hurt, dear? Please let us help you." Gathering her courage, Violet limped from the shelter of the trees. "Please," she called weakly. "I need to reach Silverton." The couple exchanged alarmed glances as they took in her appearance: torn dress, bloody scratches, the makeshift crutch supporting her weight. "Good heavens!" the woman exclaimed, already climbing down from the wagon. "Samuel, help me get her up. Are you running from someone, miss?" The man asked as he assisted his wife in helping Violet to the wagon. Violet nodded, too exhausted for pretense. "Men who want to force me into marriage. Please, I need to find a boarding house on Cedar Street, a yellow house with green shutters. A woman named Eliza lives there." "Eliza Cross?" the woman asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Why, we know Eliza well. She's a fine woman." Relief flooded through Violet. "Her brother sent me," she managed before her legs gave way entirely. The couple helped her into the wagon bed, making her as comfortable as possible on some empty grain sacks. The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Bennett, insisted on cleaning and bandaging Violet's worst injuries with supplies from a small medical kit. "We're headed to Silverton ourselves," Samuel explained as he flicked the reins to set the wagon in motion again. "Taking eggs and butter to market. We can have you at Eliza's doorstep in an hour." True to his word, the Bennetts delivered Violet to the yellow boarding house on Cedar Street just as the town was coming fully awake. Silverton was larger than Violet had expected: a proper town with a main street lined with businesses, side streets filled with homes, and the constant activity of a growing settlement. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and up the steps of the neat 2-story boarding house. Before they could knock, the door swung open, revealing a tall woman with shrewd gray eyes, the same shade as Xavier's, and dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. "Ruth, Samuel," she greeted them warmly before her gaze fell on Violet. Concern immediately replaced her smile. "What's happened here?" "This young lady says she was sent by your brother," Ruth explained. "She's in a bad way, Eliza." Recognition dawned in Eliza's eyes. "You're the one Xavier helped escape." It wasn't a question. "We received his telegram 2 days ago." "Telegram," Violet repeated, hope flaring in her chest. "He's alive, last I heard," Eliza confirmed, gently taking Violet's arm to support her. Though his message was frustratingly brief as usual, just said to expect a young woman named Violet who needed safe harbor and that he was leading some trouble away. She studied Violet's face. Looks like the trouble found you anyway. One of them tracked me, Violet admitted as Eliza guided her inside. I got away, but you're half dead from the effort, Eliza finished for her. Ruth, would you fetch Dr. Mills? Samuel, thank you for bringing her to me. After the Bennets departed, Ruth promising to return with the doctor, Eliza helped Violet to a comfortable bedroom on the ground floor. Xavier said you help women in difficult situations, Violet said, as Eliza eased her onto the bed. I do, Eliza confirmed, efficiently removing Violet's ruined shoes. Women with no place to go, no one to protect them. She smiled slightly, though most don't arrive quite so dramatically as you have. Despite her pain and exhaustion, Violet found herself warming to Eliza's straightforward manner, so similar to her brother's in its lack of pretense. Did Xavier's telegram say anything else? When he might come to Silverton? Eliza shook her head. Just that he'd led the pursuers west toward the Colorado border. She paused, studying Violet with newfound interest. You're worried about him. It wasn't a question, but Violet answered anyway. He risked everything for me, a complete stranger. I don't know if he's safe if the men chasing us. My brother has been evading trouble since he was 14 years old, Eliza said confidently. He knows how to disappear when necessary. She patted Violet's hand. Rest now. We'll talk more when the doctor has seen to your injuries. The next few days passed in a blur of sleep, pain, and gradual recovery. Dr. Mills confirmed that Violet's ankle was badly sprained but not broken, and that while she had suffered numerous cuts, bruises, and 2 cracked ribs, none of her injuries were life-threatening. Remarkable, considering what you've been through, he commented as he wrapped her ribs. Eliza proved to be as kind as she was practical. She asked no prying questions about Violet's past, simply providing what was needed: clean clothes, nourishing food, and above all, safety. The boarding house, Violet learned, was home to 5 other women, each with her own story of escape from difficult circumstances. Most will move on eventually, Eliza explained as she changed the bandages on Violet's ankle. Once they've saved enough money or found a secure situation. Some find work in town, others remarry on their own terms this time. And some stay, Violet asked. Some stay, Eliza agreed with a small smile. Lily teaches piano now. Margaret works at the assayer's office. They've built new lives here. The possibility of building a new life, one of her own choosing, was still overwhelming to Violet. Each day brought small improvements in her physical condition, but the constant worry about Xavier's fate prevented full healing of her spirit. A week after her arrival, Violet was sitting on the front porch of the boarding house, her bandaged ankle propped on a stool, when Eliza brought out a telegram. "Just arrived for you," she said, handing Violet the yellow paper. Violet stared at it in confusion. "For me. But no one knows I'm here except." Her heart leapt as she unfolded the telegram with trembling fingers. "V stop am safe stop will reach Silverton in 3 days stop wait for me stop X." The message was brief, but it sent a wave of relief washing through Violet's body. Xavier was alive. He was coming to Silverton. He had asked her to wait. Eliza, reading over her shoulder, smiled knowingly. "Well now, that's interesting." "What is?" Violet asked, still staring at the precious telegram. "In all the years I've known my brother, I've never seen him ask anyone to wait for him," Eliza replied. "He comes, he goes, owing nothing to anyone. Yet here he is, asking you to wait." Violet felt warmth rising to her cheeks. "He probably just wants to make sure I arrived safely." "Hum," Eliza hummed skeptically. "The telegram to me accomplished that. This," she tapped the paper in Violet's hands, "is something else entirely." Before Violet could formulate a response, a commotion on the street drew their attention. A wagon was pulling up in front of the sheriff's office across the way, several men climbing down from it. With a jolt, Violet recognized one of them, the bounty hunter who had tracked her in the mountains. "Eliza," she whispered urgently, shrinking back against her chair. "That man, he's one of Patterson's men, the one who found me on the mountain." Eliza's expression hardened as she observed the men speaking with the sheriff. "Inside, quickly," she ordered, helping Violet to her feet. "They haven't seen you yet." Once inside, Eliza positioned Violet away from windows while she herself watched through the curtains. "They're showing the sheriff some papers," she reported. "Likely an arrest warrant for you and Xavier." "Can they do that?" Violet asked, fear constricting her throat. "Force me to return." "They can try," Eliza replied grimly. "But Sheriff Donovan is a fair man. He'll want to hear both sides." She turned from the window. "We need to get your story to him before they poison his mind with their version." Within the hour, Eliza had dispatched a trusted friend, the town's newspaper editor, to speak privately with the sheriff. By evening, word returned that while the sheriff couldn't ignore an official warrant from a neighboring county, he was willing to hear Violet's testimony before taking any action. "He'll come here tomorrow morning," Eliza's friend reported. "Says a lady recovering from injuries shouldn't have to drag herself to his office when he has perfectly good legs to carry him here." That night, Violet barely slept, torn between relief at Xavier's imminent arrival and fear that she might be arrested before he reached Silverton. The prospect of being forcibly returned to Cottonwood Springs to her father and Theodore Patterson filled her with dread. Sheriff Donovan arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. He was a stocky man with a weathered face and kind eyes that belied his stern expression. After introductions, he settled into a chair in Eliza's parlor, notebook in hand. "Miss Dawson," he began, "I've got men in my town claiming you were kidnapped from your home, that a cowboy named Xavier Cross took you against your will, and that your father and fiancé are desperate to have you safely returned." "That's a lie," Violet stated firmly. "I was fleeing a forced marriage to Theodore Patterson, a man 30 years my senior with a reputation for cruelty. My father beat me when I refused." She met the sheriff's eyes directly. "Xavier Cross saved my life." Over the next hour, Violet told her story in full: her mother's death, her father's deteriorating behavior, the arrangement with Judge Patterson, and finally, Xavier's intervention and their flight across the territory. She showed the sheriff her still healing injuries, both those inflicted by her father and those sustained during her escape in the mountains. Throughout her testimony, Sheriff Donovan listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When she finished, he remained silent for several moments. "Judge Patterson has considerable influence," he finally said. "His warrant carries weight even here." Violet's heart sank. "However," the sheriff continued, "I've known Eliza Cross for 5 years. She's a woman of unimpeachable character. If she vouches for you, and your story is as you've told it." He closed his notebook decisively. "I see no kidnapping here, just a woman exercising her right to determine her own future." "Then you won't send me back?" Violet asked, hardly daring to hope. "Not against your will," Sheriff Donovan confirmed. "You're of legal age. If you state for the record that you left voluntarily and wish to remain here, that should satisfy the letter of the law." Relief flooded through Violet. "I do so state," she said firmly. "I left of my own free will and have no desire to return." The sheriff nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll inform Patterson's men of my decision. They won't like it, but they have no authority to remove you from my jurisdiction without my cooperation." He paused at the door. "Miss Dawson, I suggest you remain at the boarding house until this matter is fully resolved. Silverton is generally peaceful, but I can't guarantee these men won't try something desperate." After he left, Eliza squeezed Violet's hand. "You did well," she said approvingly. "Sheriff Donovan is a good man, but he needed to hear the truth from you directly." "Will it be enough?" Violet wondered. "Judge Patterson isn't a man who accepts defeat easily." "We'll be vigilant," Eliza promised, "and Xavier will be here in 2 days. Between my brother and the sheriff, you'll have protection enough." The next 48 hours passed with excruciating slowness. Violet divided her time between helping with chores around the boarding house, limited by her healing ankle but eager to contribute, and watching the road from town, hoping for a glimpse of a dappled gray horse carrying a tall, broad-shouldered rider. Patterson's men remained in Silverton, taking rooms at the hotel and making no secret of their presence. Twice they rode slowly past the boarding house, studying it with obvious interest. Sheriff Donovan increased patrols in the area, but admitted he couldn't arrest them simply for looking. On the morning of the 3rd day after receiving Xavier's telegram, Violet was helping Eliza prepare breakfast when hoofbeats on the street drew their attention. Violet's heart leapt, but Eliza's cautious peering through the curtains dashed her hopes. "Patterson's men again," Eliza reported grimly. "All 3 of them this time." Before she could continue, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Eliza motioned for Violet to stay back as she went to answer it. "Good morning, gentlemen." Eliza's voice carried clearly to where Violet stood in the kitchen. "The sheriff has already made his position clear regarding Miss Dawson." "We're not here about the girl today, madam," came the reply, the voice of the bounty hunter who had tracked Violet. "We're delivering a message from Judge Patterson to your brother, Xavier Cross." Violet moved closer to the doorway, straining to hear. "My brother isn't here," Eliza stated coolly. "But he's expected," the man persisted. "Our sources say he's heading this way. When he arrives, tell him Judge Patterson is offering a deal. He drops all charges against Cross if the girl returns voluntarily to marry Theodore as arranged." "And if she refuses?" Eliza challenged. "Then Cross will be charged with kidnapping, theft, and attempted murder of lawmen in pursuit of their duty." The bounty hunter's voice hardened. "That's a hanging offense in Arizona territory." Ice filled Violet's veins. They were using her to trap Xavier, forcing an impossible choice: her freedom or his life. "I'll relay your message when my brother arrives," Eliza said stiffly. "Now please leave my property." After the men departed, Eliza found Violet in the kitchen, her face ashen. "You heard," Violet nodded, her mind racing. "I can't let Xavier hang because of me." "Don't even think about surrendering yourself," Eliza said sharply. "That's exactly what they want. But what choice do we have?" Violet asked desperately. "I won't be responsible for Xavier's death." Eliza's expression softened. "My brother has evaded worse than this, Violet. Let's wait until he arrives before making any decisions. He may have ideas we haven't considered." But as the day wore on with no sign of Xavier, Violet's anxiety mounted. What if Patterson's men intercepted him before he reached Silverton? What if they had already arrested him on the trail? The possibilities tormented her. By evening, Violet had reached a decision. If Xavier hadn't arrived by morning, she would surrender herself to protect him. She couldn't bear the thought of him risking the noose for her sake. As twilight deepened into night, Violet sat alone on the back porch of the boarding house, gazing up at the emerging stars. The same stars, she thought, that had watched over their campsite in the mountains, that had guided her desperate flight to Silverton. Somewhere beneath them, Xavier was making his way toward her, or had already been captured. The soft creak of a floorboard behind her was Violet's only warning before a hand gently covered her mouth. She stiffened, ready to scream when a familiar voice whispered near her ear, "It's me." Don't make a sound. Xavier. He removed his hand as Violet turned, hardly daring to believe her eyes. He stood in the shadows of the porch, hat pulled low over his face, but there was no mistaking his tall figure or the quiet confidence of his stance. Xavier, she breathed, rising to her feet. How did you back way? He explained in a hushed voice, nodding toward the alley behind the house. Patterson's men are watching the front. Eliza doesn't know I'm here yet. In the dim light from the kitchen window, Violet could see that Xavier looked trail-worn and exhausted. A half-healed cut marked his left cheekbone, and he held himself stiffly, suggesting other injuries. You're hurt, she said, reaching toward the cut on his face. Xavier caught her hand, holding it briefly before releasing it. It's nothing. I've had worse. His eyes searched her face intently. You made it, when I heard you'd been tracked in the mountains. It was close, Violet admitted. But I reached Eliza just as you said. Urgency returned to her voice. Xavier, Patterson's men are here. They have a warrant for your arrest, kidnapping, theft, attempted murder. They say it's a hanging offense. I expected as much, Xavier replied grimly. Reed and his boys aren't known for forgiveness when someone gets the better of them. They came this morning with an offer, Violet continued. If I return voluntarily to marry Theodore Patterson, all charges against you will be dropped. Xavier's expression hardened. Not a chance. But they'll hang you, Violet protested, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. They have to catch me first, Xavier reminded her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. And I've gotten rather good at not being caught. This isn't a joke, Violet insisted. I won't let you die because of me. Xavier's expression softened as he looked at her. In the dim light, his gray eyes held an intensity that made Violet's heart beat faster. You know what I thought about every mile of the way here, he asked quietly. Not Patterson's men, not the warrant. I thought about whether you had made it safely to Eliza, whether you were healing, whether, he paused, seeming to search for words, whether you might be glad to see me again. Of course I'm glad, Violet whispered, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. I've been watching the road every day, praying you were safe. I made a promise, Xavier said simply. I told you I'd find you in Silverton. Something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, made Violet bold. And now that you have. Before he could answer, the back door opened, spilling lamplight across the porch. Eliza stood framed in the doorway, her expression shifting rapidly from alarm to recognition. Xavier Cross, she exclaimed softly, sneaking into my house like a thief. Hello, sister, Xavier greeted her with a faint smile. Sorry for the dramatic entrance, seemed prudent under the circumstances. Eliza shook her head in exasperation. Inside, both of you, whatever plans you're hatching, better to do it where Patterson's men can't overhear. In the warm kitchen, Eliza quickly prepared food for Xavier while he explained how he had evaded the bounty hunters, leading them on a chase toward the Colorado border before doubling back toward Silverton. I circled around town and approached from the south, he finished, gratefully accepting the coffee Eliza pressed into his hands. Came in through Wilson's Gulch to avoid the main roads. Clever, Eliza acknowledged, but it only buys us time. Patterson's men know you're coming. They'll search every inch of Silverton if they have to. Let them search, Xavier said. By morning we'll be gone. We, Violet and Eliza asked simultaneously. Xavier looked at Violet, his expression softening. If you're willing. I have friends at a ranch near Santa Fe. It's far enough from Patterson's influence that you could start fresh there. And you, Violet asked, her heart quickening at the implied invitation. Will you stay there too? Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or a question of his own. I hadn't planned that far, he admitted. But I know the owner needs a foreman. It could be a place to stop drifting if that's what I wanted. The weight of unspoken possibilities hung in the air between them. Violet found herself unable to look away from Xavier's steady gaze, from the quiet question it contained. Eliza cleared her throat pointedly. "Before you two plan your future, we need to get you safely out of Silverton." She fixed her brother with a stern look. "Patterson's men are serious, Xavier. They have legal papers, and they've made it clear they'll see you hang if Violet doesn't return with them." "Sheriff Donovan is on our side," Violet reminded them. "He said he wouldn't force me to return against my will." "Donovan's a good man," Xavier agreed, "but his jurisdiction ends at the town limits. Once we're on the open road, we're vulnerable unless we can reach territorial authorities in Santa Fe." Eliza tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "You need a diversion to get out of town unnoticed. And a faster horse than that gray of yours, distinctive as he is. They'll spot him immediately." "I can handle the horse," Xavier said. "Joe Blackstone sent a bay gelding ahead with a friend. It's waiting at the livery on the south end of town." "And the diversion?" Eliza prompted. Xavier grinned, looking suddenly years younger. "That's where you come in, sister dear." By dawn, the plan was set. Eliza would create a distraction at the north end of town that would draw Patterson's men away from the southern route. Meanwhile, Xavier and Violet would slip out via the back roads, meeting up with the friend holding the fresh horse at the livery stable. "Once you're clear of town," Eliza instructed, "ride hard for the territorial border. I've prepared letters for both of you, one to the territorial marshal explaining the situation, another to Judge Hawkins in Santa Fe. He's an old friend and no admirer of Patterson." As the first light of dawn colored the eastern sky, Eliza embraced her brother tightly. "Try not to disappear for a year this time," she murmured. "I'll send word when we're safe," Xavier promised. Turning to Violet, Eliza pressed a small bundle into her hands. "Fresh bandages for your ankle, some food, and a little money. It's not much, but it will help." Violet hugged the older woman fiercely. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget your kindness." "Be happy," Eliza whispered, "and keep an eye on that brother of mine. He needs someone to remind him there's more to life than wandering." With final farewells, Xavier and Violet slipped out the back door and into the alley behind the boarding house. The town was just beginning to stir, early risers opening shops and stoking fires. Moving quickly but casually, they made their way through back streets toward the livery stable. Xavier kept Violet's hand firmly in his, guiding her around potential points of visibility. Despite the danger, Violet felt a strange exhilaration. After a lifetime of having decisions made for her, she was actively choosing her own path, however uncertain it might be. They reached the livery without incident. Inside, a man was waiting with two saddled horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller sorrel mare. "Two horses?" Xavier questioned, surprised. "Your sister's idea," the man explained. "Said the lady shouldn't have to ride double all the way to Santa Fe." Xavier nodded appreciatively. "Eliza thinks of everything." After a brief exchange of thanks and final instructions, Xavier helped Violet mount the sorrel, checking that her injured ankle was properly positioned in the stirrup. His hands lingered at her waist longer than strictly necessary, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ready?" he asked softly. Violet nodded, unable to find words for the mix of fear and anticipation churning inside her. This was it, the final break with her past, the first true step into a future of her own choosing. Xavier swung easily into the saddle of the bay, leading the way to the rear door of the livery that opened onto a seldom-used trail. Just as they prepared to ride out, the distant sound of shouting came from the north end of town. That's Eliza's diversion, Xavier said with a grin. Time to go. They rode out at an easy trot, not wanting to attract attention before they cleared the town limits. Violet kept glancing back, half expecting to see Patterson's men in pursuit, but the streets behind them remained empty. Only when they reached the cover of a pine forest south of town did Xavier signal for a faster pace. The horses responded eagerly, settling into a ground-eating lope that put distance between them and Silverton with every stride. "How long to Santa Fe?" Violet asked when they slowed to rest the horses at a small stream. 3 days, maybe 4 with your ankle, Xavier replied, helping her dismount. "We'll avoid the main roads, stay to the high country where we're less likely to be spotted." As Violet drank from the stream, splashing cool water on her face, she studied Xavier covertly. In the morning light, she could see more clearly the toll their adventure had taken on him, the new lines around his eyes, the healing cut on his cheek, the careful way he moved suggesting other, hidden injuries. Yet there was something different about him too, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before, a steady resolve that went beyond mere survival. "What?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking," Violet replied honestly, "about how much has changed in 2 weeks, how much I've changed." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Freedom does that, shows you who you really are when no one's forcing you to be something else." "And who am I?" Violet wondered aloud. "Without my father defining me, without being someone's daughter or someone's intended wife." "That's for you to discover," Xavier said simply. "But from what I've seen, you're braver than you know, stronger too." He paused, then added quietly, "and someone worth crossing territories for." The simple statement warmed Violet more than any flowery declaration could have. In that moment, standing beside a stream in the wilderness with danger still at their backs, she realized that her feelings for Xavier had grown far beyond gratitude or the heady rush of escape. "We should keep moving," Xavier said, reluctance evident in his voice as he helped her back onto the sorrel mare. "We want to reach the pass before nightfall." Throughout the day, they rode steadily southeast, following game trails and old native paths that Xavier seemed to know instinctively. By late afternoon, they had climbed into higher country where pines gave way to aspen groves, their leaves shimmering gold in the autumn light. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a small lake. Xavier efficiently gathered firewood while Violet laid out their bedrolls and prepared a simple meal from the supplies Eliza had provided. The domesticity of the scene struck Violet as they sat beside the fire, sharing food and quiet conversation. This felt different from their flight from Cottonwood Springs, less desperate, more deliberate. They were choosing this journey together, facing whatever came next as partners rather than rescuer and rescued. "Tell me about the ranch near Santa Fe," Violet requested as they finished their meal. "The one where your friends might hire you as foreman." Xavier leaned back against his saddle, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "It's called Sundown Ranch. Belongs to an old trail boss I worked for years ago, Emmett Sullivan. He's getting on in years, looking to step back from the day-to-day running of things. And there would be a place for me there too," Violet asked, trying to picture herself in this new setting. "Emmett's wife died last year," Xavier explained. "Their daughter manages the house but could use help. She has young children to look after." He glanced at Violet. "But that's just one possibility. Santa Fe's a growing town. There would be other opportunities if you preferred." Violet heard the careful neutrality in his voice, the way he left her options open. "And what about you?" she asked directly. "Would you stay at Sundown Ranch, put down roots after all these years of drifting?" Xavier was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I've been thinking about that," he finally admitted. About why I never stay in one place for long. Why don't you? Violet prompted gently when he didn't continue. Partly habit, I suppose, Xavier said with a slight shrug. When you've spent most of your life moving on, staying put feels uncomfortable. He looked up, meeting her eyes across the fire. But mostly, I think I never found a reason to stop. Never found something or someone that made me want to build something lasting. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Violet's heart quickened at the vulnerability in Xavier's expression, so different from his usual self-assured demeanor. And now? She asked softly. Xavier held her gaze steadily. Now I'm wondering if maybe I have. Before Violet could respond, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their campfire. Xavier was on his feet instantly, revolver drawn as he positioned himself between Violet and the potential threat. Who's there? He called sharply. Show yourself. Easy, cowboy, came a familiar drawling voice as a figure emerged from the shadows, just looking for a warm fire on a cold night. Violet recognized him immediately, the bounty hunter who had tracked her in the mountains, the one who had delivered Patterson's ultimatum at the boarding house. He stood at the edge of the firelight, hands raised to show they were empty, but his confident smirk suggested he was far from harmless. Reed, Xavier acknowledged tersely, his revolver still trained on the man. How did you find us? Wasn't hard, Reed replied with a shrug. Your sister's diversion was clever, but I figured you'd head south. Only 2 trails lead that way, I just had to pick the right one. He glanced at Violet. Evening, Miss Dawson. You're looking better than the last time I saw you. Where are the others? Xavier demanded, scanning the darkness behind Reed. Back in Silverton, still chasing wild geese thanks to your sister. Reed chuckled. I work alone when I can. Fewer people to split the bounty with. There won't be any bounty tonight, Xavier stated flatly. Turn around and ride out, Reed, while you still can. The bounty hunter sighed dramatically. Now that's not very hospitable, and here I came with an offer. We've heard Patterson's offer, Violet said, finding her voice. I won't go back. Reed's gaze shifted to her, calculating. Judge Patterson is a proud man, Miss Dawson, doesn't like being defied, but even proud men can be practical when necessary. He returned his attention to Xavier. The offer's changed. $500 in gold if you both disappear. Leave the territory, don't come back, no charges pursued. Xavier's expression remained unchanged. And why would Patterson suddenly be so generous? Let's just say certain facts have come to light that make the judge less eager for a public confrontation, Reed replied enigmatically. Theodore Patterson was found in a compromising position with the blacksmith's daughter. Seems his interest in a young bride wasn't as exclusive as he claimed. Violet felt a surge of vindication at this revelation, followed quickly by suspicion. If that's true, why are you still pursuing us? Professional pride, partly, Reed admitted with a casual shrug. Never lost a quarry before you two, but mostly because I've got a better offer. He reached slowly into his vest pocket, removing a folded document. This arrived for you at the Silverton Telegraph office. I took the liberty of collecting it. Xavier kept his revolver steady, making no move to accept the paper. What is it? Telegram from Cottonwood Springs, Reed said. Your father died 2 days ago, Miss Dawson. Seems he had a weak heart all along. The sheriff's trying to locate you as his sole heir. Shock rendered Violet momentarily speechless. Her father dead. After a lifetime under his control, the news felt unreal, as if Reed were speaking of a stranger. Why should we believe you? Xavier demanded. Reed tossed the telegram onto the ground between them. Read it yourself. I've got no reason to lie about this. Xavier kept his revolver trained on Reed while gesturing for Violet to retrieve the telegram. With trembling hands, She unfolded the paper and read the brief message by the firelight. It was addressed to her, care of Eliza Cross's boarding house, and confirmed exactly what Reed had said. Herbert Dawson had died of heart failure, and as his only living relative, Violet was needed to settle his affairs. "It's true," she whispered, looking up at Xavier with stunned eyes. "He's dead." Xavier's expression softened with concern for her, but his aim never wavered from Reed. "That still doesn't explain why you're here instead of collecting Patterson's bounty." "Like I said, circumstances have changed," Reed replied. "Judge Patterson's position is complicated now. His son's indiscretions have become public knowledge, making his pursuit of Miss Dawson look less like justice and more like a cover for scandal." He spread his hands. "I'm a businessman. The bounty on you two is likely to evaporate. But helping the sole heir of Herbert Dawson return safely to claim her inheritance, that could be profitable." "My father had nothing," Violet said bitterly. "The farm was mortgaged to the hilt. There is no inheritance." Reed's slow smile suggested otherwise. "That's where you're wrong, Miss Dawson. Seems your father had one last streak of luck before his heart gave out. Won a significant sum in a poker game against a mining investor, including partial ownership of a silver claim that's just started producing." Xavier and Violet exchanged skeptical glances. "Convenient timing," Xavier commented dryly. "Fortune favors the foolish as often as the brave," Reed replied philosophically. "Point is, there's money waiting in Cottonwood Springs, enough that my services as an escort back would be well compensated." He eyed Xavier. "By you, not Patterson." A tense silence fell over the camp as Xavier considered the bounty hunter's words. Violet watched him, reading the conflict in his expression. If Reed was telling the truth, her entire situation had changed. She was no longer a fugitive fleeing a forced marriage, but an heiress with resources and options. "What do you want?" Xavier finally asked Reed. $200 for safe passage back to Cottonwood Springs," Reed stated. "Plus whatever Judge Patterson has already paid me as a retainer, which I'll keep for my trouble." "And if we refuse?" Xavier questioned, his voice hard. Reed shrugged. "Then I ride back to Silverton alone and you two continue to Santa Fe. No skin off my nose either way." "But I thought you might appreciate knowing your circumstances had changed." Xavier glanced at Violet, a silent question in his eyes. The decision was hers: continue to Santa Fe as planned, or return to claim what was rightfully hers. "I need to think," Violet said softly. "This is unexpected." "Take your time," Reed said magnanimously, settling himself by the fire as if invited. "I'm in no hurry." Xavier lowered his revolver slightly, though his posture remained alert. "Step back from the fire, Reed. Keep your hands where I can see them." As Reed complied, moving to sit on a fallen log at the edge of the firelight, Xavier drew Violet aside, still keeping the bounty hunter in his line of sight. "Do you believe him?" Violet asked in a hushed voice. "About your father's death, possibly. About the inheritance." Xavier's expression was skeptical. "That seems too convenient, but if it's true—" Violet trailed off, her mind racing with implications. "If it's true, you'd be financially independent," Xavier completed the thought. "Free to go anywhere, do anything you choose." Something in his tone made Violet study his face more closely. "Does that change things between us?" Xavier's eyes softened as they met hers. "Not for me," he said quietly, "but it might for you. You'd have choices you didn't have before." "I already made my choice," Violet replied, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions inside her. "When I got on your horse that day, when I decided to ride to Silverton, when I agreed to go to Santa Fe with you, those were my choices." A smile touched Xavier's lips, genuine and unguarded. "Then we're agreed." We verify if Reed's telling the truth, Violet said decisively. If my father is really dead, if there truly is an inheritance, I want to claim it not for myself, but to finally be free of his shadow completely. She took a deep breath. And then we go to Santa Fe as planned. Xavier nodded, squeezing her hand briefly before turning back to Reed, who sat watching them with poorly disguised curiosity. Here's what's going to happen, Xavier informed the bounty hunter. We'll continue to the next town with a telegraph office. Violet will send a message to Sheriff Donovan in Silverton asking him to confirm her father's death and the existence of any inheritance. If your story checks out, we'll consider your offer. Reed considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Carson's Creek is half a day's ride from here. They've got a telegraph office. Until then, you'll keep your distance, Xavier continued firmly. Ride ahead of us, not behind. Any sudden moves and our agreement is over. You're not a very trusting man, Cross, Reed observed with a sardonic smile. I've learned to be careful about the company I keep, Xavier replied evenly. That night, neither Violet nor Xavier slept much. Reed made his camp on the far side of the clearing, but his presence cast a shadow over what had been, just hours earlier, a moment of revelation between them. Violet lay awake, her mind churning with conflicting emotions about her father's death and the possibility of an inheritance. Xavier, she whispered into the darkness, knowing he was awake despite his even breathing. He responded quietly. If it's true about my father, about the inheritance, would you come to Cottonwood Springs with me? Before we go to Santa Fe. There was a moment of silence before Xavier replied. If that's what you want. It is, Violet confirmed. I need to see it for myself to know it's really over. And I don't want to face it alone. Then you won't, Xavier promised simply. With that reassurance, Violet finally drifted into restless sleep, dreaming of her father's farm, of silver gleaming in the earth, and of Xavier standing beside her as she closed the door on her past forever. Morning brought clearer heads and a renewed determination to verify Reed's claims. They broke camp efficiently, Reed keeping to himself as agreed. The ride to Carson's Creek took most of the day, the trail winding through increasingly settled country as they descended from the high country. Carson's Creek proved to be little more than a stagecoach stop with a general store, saloon, and the precious telegraph office. As they rode into town, Xavier directed Reed to wait at the saloon while he accompanied Violet to send her telegram. The telegraph operator, a young man with spectacles perched on his nose, took Violet's message to Sheriff Donovan with businesslike efficiency. Response might take a few hours, he informed them. Depends on when the Silverton operator gets it and how busy the sheriff is. With nothing to do but wait, Xavier and Violet found a small cafe adjacent to the general store. Over a simple meal of stew and cornbread, they discussed their next steps. If Reed's telling the truth, we'll need to decide whether to trust him as an escort back to Cottonwood Springs, Xavier said, keeping his voice low despite the nearly empty cafe. Do we need an escort? Violet questioned. If my father is dead and Judge Patterson's influence is waning due to his son's scandal, is there still danger? Xavier considered this. Less perhaps, but not none. The judge isn't a man to forget a slight. Having Reed with us might actually be safer than traveling alone. He knows Patterson's methods, his contacts. The enemy of my enemy, Violet suggested with a small smile. Something like that, Xavier agreed, returning her smile, though I wouldn't turn my back on him completely. After their meal, they returned to the telegraph office. To their surprise, a response from Sheriff Donovan was already waiting. Violet read it aloud in a hushed voice. Herbert Dawson, deceased, stop heart failure confirmed by Dr. Stop Silver claim inheritance verified by bank stop significant value. Stop Patterson scandal, public knowledge, stop warrant withdrawn, stop safe to return if desired, stop Donovan. Violet stared at the telegram, emotions washing through her in waves. Relief that the threat from Patterson had been neutralized. Shock that her father's gambling had, in his final days, actually resulted in something of value. And beneath it all, a strange emptiness, the realization that the man who had dominated her life with fear and control was truly gone. "It's real," she whispered, looking up at Xavier with wide eyes. "All of it." Xavier squeezed her shoulder gently. "Changes things." "Not everything," Violet said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. "I still want to go to Santa Fe with you. But first, I need to go home to settle my father's affairs and claim what's mine." "Then that's what we'll do," Xavier agreed, his expression softening. Together, they found Reed waiting expectantly at the saloon, nursing a whiskey. He raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Well, your information checks out," Xavier confirmed, sliding into a chair across from the bounty hunter. "Sheriff Donovan confirms Dawson's death and the inheritance." A satisfied smile spread across Reed's face. "Told you. So do we have a deal?" Xavier glanced at Violet, who nodded slightly. 100 now, 100 when we reach Cottonwood Springs safely," Xavier countered. "And you ride with us, not ahead or behind." Reed considered for a moment, then extended his hand. "Deal." As they shook on it, Violet felt a strange sense of destiny shifting around her. 2 weeks ago, she had been a virtual prisoner in her father's house, facing a future of continued subjugation as Theodore Patterson's wife. Now she was negotiating with the man who had hunted her, preparing to return to Cottonwood Springs as a woman of independent means, with Xavier Cross at her side. The journey back to Cottonwood Springs took 4 days, a more direct route than their flight had been, but still cautious. Despite Sheriff Donovan's assurance that the warrant had been withdrawn, Xavier insisted on avoiding the main roads until they were closer to town. Reed proved to be an unobjectionable traveling companion, keeping largely to himself, except when offering useful information about the terrain or potential hazards ahead. Violet found herself reluctantly revising her opinion of the bounty hunter. He was a mercenary, certainly, but not malicious. On the final day of their journey, as the familiar landscape of Cottonwood Springs came into view, Violet felt a complex mixture of emotions. This place held nothing but painful memories, yet it was where her life had begun, where her mother was buried, where for better or worse she had become the woman she was. "You all right?" Xavier asked softly, riding beside her as they approached the town limits. Violet nodded, drawing strength from his presence. "It feels strange, coming back like this, as if I'm a different person returning to a place that hasn't changed." "You are different," Xavier observed. "The place probably is too, in ways you'll see more clearly now." They rode directly to the sheriff's office, Reed accompanying them as agreed. Sheriff Parker, a portly man with a gray mustache, looked up in surprise as they entered. "Miss Dawson," he greeted her, rising from his desk. "We've been expecting you." His gaze shifted to Xavier, narrowing slightly. "And you must be Cross." "Sheriff," Xavier acknowledged with a nod. Parker's attention moved to Reed, recognition dawning. "Reed, didn't expect to see you escorting these two." "Business arrangement," Reed replied with a shrug. "Judge Patterson's interests have shifted." The sheriff snorted. "That's one way of putting it. Between his son's scandal and Herbert Dawson's sudden good fortune, the judge has been keeping a low profile lately." He turned back to Violet. "My condolences for your father, Miss Dawson. The funeral was held 3 days ago." Violet nodded, feeling strangely detached. "Thank you, Sheriff. I understand there are legal matters to address regarding my father's estate," Indeed there are, Parker confirmed, reaching for a stack of papers on his desk. The bank has the details about the silver claim, but the short version is this. Your father won a 20% stake in the two sisters' mine during his last poker game. The mine struck a significant vein just days before his death. The other owners are eager to either buy out your share or have you as a partner. Violet blinked, the reality of her changed circumstances beginning to sink in. And the farm, mortgaged, as you probably know, Parker replied. But given the value of the mine shares, you could clear that debt easily if you wanted to keep the property. Xavier, who had been listening silently, spoke up. How much are we talking about, Sheriff? The value of the mine shares. Parker named a figure that made Violet's breath catch. It wasn't a fortune by Eastern standards, but in the Arizona territory, it represented financial independence beyond anything she had imagined possible. The bank manager can give you the details, Parker continued. He's expecting you. As they prepared to leave, Reed cleared his throat pointedly. Our business arrangement, Xavier nodded, counting out the remaining $100 they had agreed upon. As promised. Reed pocketed the money with satisfaction. Pleasure doing business with you both, if you ever need someone tracked down again. He tipped his hat with a sardonic smile and departed. Outside the sheriff's office, Violet took a deep breath of the familiar air of Cottonwood Springs. The town looked exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow smaller, less intimidating. The people passing on the street, some of whom she had known all her life, glanced at her with curious expressions, clearly aware of her dramatic departure and unexpected return. Shall we see the banker? Xavier suggested gently, sensing her discomfort at being the object of such scrutiny. Violet nodded gratefully, and they made their way to the town's small bank. The manager, Mr. Hollies, greeted her with newfound respect that bordered on obsequiousness, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she had received in the past as Herbert Dawson's daughter. The meeting confirmed everything Sheriff Parker had told them. Violet emerged as the owner of a substantial share in a promising silver mine, with offers already being made to purchase her stake if she preferred an immediate payout to ongoing partnership. I'll need time to consider my options, she told Hollies, overwhelmed by the decisions before her. Of course, Miss Dawson, the banker agreed readily. In the meantime, I've had your father's personal effects from his desk brought here for safekeeping. He produced a small wooden box. The sheriff thought you might want these. Violet accepted the box with mixed emotions. It contained the mundane remnants of her father's life, his pocket watch, some letters, a small leather-bound ledger, and at the bottom, something unexpected. A faded photograph of her mother, smiling, with a much younger Herbert Dawson standing proudly beside her. I never saw this before, Violet murmured, showing the photograph to Xavier. He kept it hidden all these years. Xavier studied the image, his expression thoughtful. He loved her once, he observed quietly, before grief twisted him. The simple observation brought unexpected tears to Violet's eyes, not for the father who had abused and controlled her, but for the man in the photograph who had once known happiness, who had once been capable of love. I need to see the farm, she said suddenly, tucking the photograph back into the box. Will you come with me? Xavier's steady gaze met hers. Wherever you need to go. They borrowed horses from the livery and rode the familiar 3 miles to the Dawson farm in the late afternoon light. As they crested the final hill, the farmhouse came into view, the place where Violet had spent her entire life, until that fateful day when Xavier had pulled her onto his horse and told her she was free. The house stood silent, the fields around it untended in the weeks since her father's death. Violet dismounted slowly, taking in the weathered porch where she had sat mending clothes on summer evenings, the barn where she had hidden from her father's rages, the small garden now overgrown with weeds. "It looks smaller," she observed, more to herself than to Xavier. "Places from our childhood often do," he replied, dismounting beside her. "Especially places that loomed large in our fears." They walked together to the porch. The door was unlocked, common practice in rural areas where neighbors looked after empty properties. Violet hesitated before pushing it open, uncertain what emotions would greet her inside. The interior was exactly as she remembered, yet subtly different. Without her father's dominating presence, the rooms seemed less oppressive, the shadows less threatening. Dust had settled on the furniture, giving everything a ghostly quality, as if the house itself were fading into memory. Violet moved through the rooms like a visitor in a museum, touching familiar objects with detached curiosity. The kitchen table, where she had prepared countless meals. The chair where her father had sat drinking in the evenings. The small bedroom that had been hers, sparse and functional, devoid of personal touches he would have considered frivolous. In her father's bedroom, the signs of his final moments were still evident: medicine bottles on the nightstand, sheets rumpled as if he had struggled for breath. Violet stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold into the room that had been his exclusive domain. "He died alone," she said softly, "after driving away everyone who might have cared for him." Xavier stood silently behind her, offering his presence without intruding on her grief, not for the man her father had become, but for the family that might have been in different circumstances. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farmhouse floors, Violet came to a decision. "I won't keep this place," she said with quiet certainty. "Too many ghosts." "What will you do with it?" Xavier asked. "Sell it, perhaps, to a family that can bring life back to it." She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "The mine shares too. I don't want to be tied to Cottonwood Springs, to be known forever as Herbert Dawson's daughter who made good on his last lucky hand." Xavier studied her face in the fading light. "And where will you go instead?" Violet took a deep breath, the question that had been building between them finally finding its moment. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether your offer still stands about Santa Fe, about Sundown Ranch." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. "It stands," he confirmed, his voice low. "But things have changed, Violet. You're no longer the woman running for her life depending on a stranger's help. You have resources, options." "Yes," she agreed, taking a step closer to him. "Which means I can choose freely, without desperation or fear driving my decisions." "And what would you choose?" Xavier asked. The question weighted with everything unsaid between them during their journey. Violet held his gaze steadily. "I would choose to go to Santa Fe, to see if Sundown Ranch might become a home. And I would choose to discover what might grow between us when we're not running for our lives." A smile slowly spread across Xavier's face, warming his usually guarded features. "Those are good choices," he said quietly, reaching out to touch her cheek with gentle fingers. "Ones I'd be honored to share." In the gathering darkness of the abandoned farmhouse, with the ghosts of her past all around them, Violet closed the distance between them. Xavier's arms encircled her, strong and sure, as their lips met in a kiss that held both the culmination of their journey together and the promise of the path ahead. When they finally drew apart, Violet felt a sense of rightness, of completion. "Let's leave tomorrow," she suggested. "There's nothing more for me here." Xavier nodded, his hand still resting lightly at her waist. "We'll settle your affairs with the banker in the morning, then ride for Santa Fe." They stayed that night at Cottonwood Springs' small hotel, a luxury Violet had never experienced before, having rarely been permitted to stay in town overnight. In the morning, she met with Mr. Hollies again, this time with clear instructions. Sell her share of the mine to the existing partners, pay off the mortgage on the farm, and arrange for its sale to a family who would work the land themselves, not absentee owners. And the proceeds? Hollies inquired, making notes of her wishes. Have to be transferred to the bank in Santa Fe, Violet directed confidently. The other half. She paused, an idea forming. The other half to establish a fund for young women in difficult circumstances, administered by Xavier Cross in Silverton. Xavier, standing beside her, raised an eyebrow in surprise but said nothing, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Their final stop before leaving Cottonwood Springs was the small cemetery on the edge of town. Violet stood before her mother's grave, Xavier a respectful distance behind her, giving her privacy for this farewell. "I'm free now, Mother," she whispered to the simple headstone. "Free to choose my own path, to find happiness on my own terms. I hope you can see that wherever you are." She placed a single wildflower on the grave, one she had picked from the meadow near the farm that morning. Then, with a deep breath, she turned away from the past and toward Xavier, toward the future they would discover together. As they rode out of Cottonwood Springs, Violet felt none of the fear and desperation that had marked her departure weeks earlier. In its place was a quiet confidence, a sense of possibility that expanded with every mile they put between themselves and the town of her birth. The journey to Santa Fe took just over a week, a leisurely pace compared to their earlier flight, allowing them to enjoy the changing landscapes and each other's company without the constant threat of pursuit. Each evening around their campfire, they shared stories of their pasts and dreams of their futures, the bond between them deepening with every conversation. On the final day of their journey, as they crested a rise overlooking the sprawling settlement of Santa Fe in the distance, Xavier reined his horse to a halt beside Violet's. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward the town with its distinctive adobe buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun. And beyond it, he pointed to the distant hills, Sundown Ranch. Violet took in the panoramic view, feeling a sense of anticipation rather than apprehension. "It's beautiful," she observed, "different from anything I've known." "A good place for new beginnings," Xavier agreed, his eyes on her rather than the landscape. As they prepared to continue down toward Santa Fe, Violet remembered something she had been meaning to ask. "You never told me why you stopped that day," she said, "at my father's house. You could have just delivered your message and ridden on." Xavier considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I've asked myself the same thing," he admitted. "It wasn't the first time I'd witnessed cruelty, and I've passed by plenty of farmhouses with raised voices inside." He glanced at her, something deepening in his gaze. "But something about you, the defiance in your voice, even as your father threatened you it wouldn't let me ride away." "A moment of kindness that changed everything," Violet mused. Xavier shook his head slightly. "Not kindness. Recognition, maybe. Of a spirit that deserved its freedom." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Little did I know where that recognition would lead." "To Santa Fe," Violet said with an answering smile. "To Sundown Ranch, to whatever comes next." "To whatever comes next," Xavier echoed, reaching across the space between their horses to take her hand briefly in his. Together. As they rode down toward their future, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a prisoner in her father's house to a woman freely choosing her own destiny. The path had been dangerous, painful at times, but every step had led her toward this moment, toward the man riding beside her, toward the life they would build together. She was, truly and completely, free.